So this is the second webinar we've done. We did a panel one last month, and it was so well received and so interesting that we thought we'd do another panel. And we've deliberately chosen these four lovely people because, well, not only do they represent two sides of the ocean, but they're also very energetic, and I was going to use the word opinionated, but that's not very fair. You know what I mean, in the best possible sense of that word. They have their own perspective, let's say. So I think it'll make for a good discussion. The theme is something I'm quite interested in, which is, I think a lot of people are as well, which is having gone through the year that we've all gone through, and in many cases still inside it. And I think that's one thing that I have to remind myself quite often, that despite the fact that the UK is coming out of what has been an awful situation and hopefully has some optimism, there are other parts of Europe that are going into lockdown. In fact, Italy's just gone into lockdown. So it isn't over, but I think that there's a lot of optimism around. And I think having been more or less a year on since the pandemic started, there's lots and lots that we've all collectively learned. And I thought we'd do a bit of a retrospective on some of the things that have happened in the last year. Not because I want to focus on what went wrong, but more what we learned from it and what some of the success stories were coming out of it. Because I think in reflection, you know about how to address things should they happen again. And then we'll turn very definitively to a look forward and talk about some of the key things that we believe are coming in the future. So that's the scene setting. Thank you very much all for attending. Tyann, over to you.
All right, thank you, panelists, so much for joining us. Two sides of the pond, it's lots of fun. So I just want to introduce each of you, and I think the way it records is whoever's talking is on the screen. So even though I have the gallery view and I can see all of you, I'm not so sure what the attendees see or what the recording will be. So when I say your name, if you want to just say hello so that your face appears, that would be awesome. So first on my list, I've got Dave Krauss, founder and exec of Responsibly.
Hello, everybody.
Then Alexa Nota, also founder and exec for Rent Responsibly.
Hi, everybody.
And you guys are located in the United States. I know, Dave, you're in Texas. And Alexa, are you in North Carolina today?
Yep, I am.
Perfect. Okay, then we have Alistair Handyside, exec check of PASC, exec chair of PASC. And then also, what is the name of your property too, Alistair?
High Wiscombe is the property that we have a touch stay digital welcome book. Hello, everybody.
Thank you. I didn't have that in my notes, but I knew you had a property. And then we have Merilee Karr, chair of Short-Term Accommodation Association and founder of UndertheDoormat.
Hello.
Thank you all. Okay, Andy, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Tyann. And we should add, the reason why we do the panel intro is not because we don't want to hear from you, but it's because we want to crack on with the questions and save your voices for the important part. So, and if anyone wants to know about the panelists in more detail, link them in, Google them, whatever, you'll find them all over the place because they're great people. Right, coming to the first question. So we're going to talk about how we think the vacation rental / self-catering, because we're talking to two different audiences who use two different terminologies, but how that sector has fared through the pandemic. So let's start with you, Merilee. What do you think? How's the industry been faring?
Well, look, I mean, I think it's been a roller coaster of a last year for everyone in the industry, is I think the best way to put it. Obviously, what the data shows is that when lockdowns happened last spring, in many cases, there were drops of revenue up to 90%. So we're talking, you know, kind of pretty dramatic effects of an impact on the industry. We were very fortunate in the UK that our industry was never fully shut down. So we were still allowed to operate for essential stays. And, you know, when we reopened back on the 4th of July last summer, we had a kind of tale of two different worlds, which was the vacation rental world, where you had coastal destinations, countryside destinations, which had a complete boom and were kind of fully sold out. And you had cities which continued to see, you know, a tough summer. In the autumn, what was very interesting is we started to get some data from STR, which is obviously the hospitality industry kind of benchmarking. It's actually the first time that we've had STR data on our industry to be able to compare it against also hotels and service departments and other things. And actually what that told us in the autumn was that our sector was recovering quicker than hotels and service departments and other forms of accommodation. What it also told us is that consumers are preferring our sector compared to pre-COVID. So it is 11% more popular or a preference of consumers post-COVID than pre-COVID, while virtually every other form of accommodation, from large hotels to hostels to bed and breakfasts, etc., are all actually down from pre-COVID. So what this tells me is that an industry which was already growing at 30% year on year is likely to be growing at a potentially even accelerated pace coming out of COVID. But I think we'll see a few other trends that will come around that, like the professionalization of the industry, standards, and the importance of those things, so that the operators who get those things right are probably the ones who are going to be most likely to succeed. So I think overall, that's what we kind of see in terms of trends. And we'll probably speak a little bit later about what are some of the things that as an industry we did when obviously the normal trading environment wasn't as we'd expect it to be in a normal year.
I think that's really interesting that there's so much more demand for this kind of sector coming out of the pandemic. And I think one of the things that would be interesting to touch on later, is probably not right for the question at hand, is the amount that the industry still has to do to cater to guests that have come from more traditional forms of accommodation and what their expectations might be. So hold that thought. Thank you, Merilee. Alistair, what's your perspective? I know that you hear from a lot of much smaller operators, sort of cottage, 4 or 5 cottages on a single site.
We have a mix. We have about 44,000 rental properties in membership, and they will be from an agency with 2,000 properties to somebody who has a single property, and a fabulous mix it is too. I would agree with 99.9% of what Merilee's just said. But I think we need to add into the mix that we have seen this British civil service at its absolute finest over the last 12 months in writing more legislation than has been written in the last 50 years. Most of it seems to be aimed at the self-contained accommodation market. We've all had to become experts in group sizes, legislation, when you can open, when you can't open, who can come, are they a bubble, are they not a bubble, what's a social care bubble, this is way beyond the capability of most small businesses. They are not the Stasi, they're not the police force. This has been a hopeless ask from government, and it's because they've tried to micromanage. I mean, they even came out with rules on carol singing. So no, I didn't make that up. You can Google it. There were rules on carol singing. Now, when you decide to micromanage, you then have to come up with all the answers. And what would have been a much simpler way of doing it, which is what everybody was lobbying for, was to allow businesses that could open safely in a socially distanced way and be safe operators open, and those that couldn't, because their facility perhaps was unable to open safely, those are the ones that then got the support. So you kept things going. I mean, that was the argument that everybody just failed to have. They decided to do it by sector. So we're now in this awkward phase where we're going to open on the 12th of April, but nobody else is. So you're sort of going to have this hiatus between the 12th of April and the 17th of May, where I can tell you demand is very, very, very low, because people want to go away to do things. They don't, this might be their first holiday they've had in 14 months. They don't just want to go and be able to buy an Indian takeaway. They want a bit more than that. So I think really reopening isn't until 17th of May in the UK. That's a long 15 months for most people to have had restrictions upon their business. And depending upon the size of your accommodation, of course, there will still be restrictions until the end of June. So we've really seen, if I'd said to you that I would have thought that a year ago, I'd have been writing a weekly newsletter that was justifiable in the amount of content that went in it, because the amount of change each week, I would never have believed it possible. Every week they change something changes. In a period before, when Merilee and I used to meet before COVID, You couldn't get a piece of legislation changed for years on end. And here we've got thousands of pages of it. So, you know, I think the government, we need to sort of have a cold, hard look at this from what a government intervention has been. Some of it's been very good, some of it's been very poor. If you plan for it to happen again, I'm not a superstitious guy, but if you plan for happening it again, it probably never will. So I think we should review the performance of the support that we've had. We should review the performance of the interventions by government and come up with a sort of short white paper about how they could do it better next time.
And despite what is being immensely complicated stuff for, as you've rightly said, many small operators to wrap their heads around, many have still managed to do that and have managed to continue operating. Do you think that there are still many businesses, majority of businesses, let's say, in business and still able to have a spring and summer season this year? Or do you think there are a fair degree that have folded, unfortunately, because of everything that's gone on in the last year? Where do you think the landscape is?
I think about 15% of on all the surveys, about 15% aren't planning on trading fully this year. That might be it's just too hard. That might be they've gone bust. That might be all of those terrible stories. It might also be that they're deciding that they're going to take 3, 4, 5 days between bookings because they're nervous about, you know, the virus in their property and stuff. But I think that they're a noisy minority. I think the majority of people need to look at the opportunity that we have going forwards, which, you know, again, Merilee is saying that, you know, going forwards, the bookings are really strong. The appetite for self-contained accommodation is really strong. And what we need to do is to move that conversation into how to really perform for that appetite and deliver against that appetite so that we can keep that momentum growing. So I mean, I don't want to really look back too much. You know, if people don't want to do it, that's their call. But there's a huge majority of people who want to get out there and really deliver. And they're who we need to focus on going forwards.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So that's a bit of a UK perspective in general. What's it like over in the States, Dave and Alexa? I'm not really sure which one of you to talk to first because you're kind of the same. But Alexa, let's hear from you first.
Sure, thanks. I would say we've seen quite a bit of the same thing, especially here in the US. Short-term rentals are primarily governed at the local level. So when you're looking at this entire landscape, what's happening in one town could be completely different to what's happening right next door. So exactly what Alistair was just saying, it has been very, very hard for a lot of people who weren't maybe not as familiar with their local governments or regulations as they were prior to COVID, are now having to navigate this patchwork and this rapidly shifting legislative landscape with their local ordinances and emergency ordinances and things like that. We saw over the course of the year, what was becoming a relatively heated regular ordinance discussion in a lot of places on your typical short-term rental laws paused for a moment. And then as every different town or city or community started to attempt to reopen, the result of that was just, it was quite chaotic, to be honest. The different rules that one city was putting in place versus a town or neighborhood right next door. But what we saw through that process was this sudden awakening of a lot of people who had not previously, like I mentioned, been as familiar with their governments and regulations, all of a sudden pull up a chair to the table and start learning and start voicing their concerns and voicing their opinions and their needs. And I think it was a big silver lining out of all of that chaos was that the industry as a whole mobilized like I have never seen before to educate their elected officials on the values that short-term rentals bring to their communities, the safety of them, particularly compared to hotels early on when there weren't a whole lot of clear instructions on cleaning from any entity. I think it was volatile. It was a lot like the roller coaster that Merilee mentioned, but we're getting to a point where now short-term rental legislative discussions are coming back to what they were pre-pandemic. Ignoring anything related to COVID, we're now getting back to discussions on whether they should be in residential areas versus commercial areas. What should occupancy be? Should we ban them? Should we not? And because of COVID, you now have a new army of people who are awake and are participating in that conversation. And what I'm really hopeful to see over the next year or few years is all of these people eventually create some really great and successful and fair and enforceable ordinances as we go forward. I'm sure Dave has a lot to add to that as well.
Well, actually, what I might do, if it's okay with you, Dave, is we'll shift into the second question, because we need to crack on with a few more questions. I'd like to get through to a future look at some point. So I think given what Alexis just said there about, I mean, obviously Merilee and Alistair have had their opinion on the UK, but given what Alexis just said there about the US, from your point of view, what have been the sort of the shining success stories that you've seen coming out of this kind of chaos that has been the last year?
Great question. Thank you. Forgive me. I'll add one thing on the previous question. It's to me, it's kind of this, and I was taking notes here because it's so much of what I was hoping to say was covered. So I think we're all on the same page, no matter which side of the pond we're on. But it's really a great disruption led to a great adjustment, and we're hoping that it comes to a great appreciation for short-term and vacation rentals, for the flexibility and the accommodations that they can provide in times of great disruption. And so, what I want to say, and this is kind of the shining moment, is where I think, I'm a sunny side of the street guy, so I'm always going to look for that silver lining. But ultimately, there is increased awareness. And to Merilee's point, I've seen that same statistic. Short-term vacation rentals, self-catered accommodations are really picking up a tailwind off of the pandemic in the way that hotels and their ADRs are suffering because of lack of business travel. And just look at the facts of the matter. You have private accommodations, you don't have these shared spaces, but then you can cook for yourself, larger capacity. And one of the most amazing statistics is really the length of stay. So the length of stay is virtually doubled in a lot of markets in the United States. And that really kind of, it stresses this short-term rental concept. People now are able to work remotely. That was a phenomenon that is undeniable, and the future is really untold and unwritten on that regard. But guess what? When people are able to work from home, they're also going to be at home more often, and that means neighbors are at home with short-term accommodation. So we have all this adjustment going on simultaneously. But on the fundamentals, never been more interest in short-term rentals, never been more awareness, to Alexa's point, of the rules, the regs, and the importance of rules and regs. And to Merilee and Alistair's point, we're the experts. I think that's the recognition that we have on the short-term vacation rental accommodation side. I've been an owner, a host, a manager since 2013, and I never really thought of myself as an expert in anything in my life. But I've done my 10,000 hours, right? And so have most of the people on this call. So I think it's our job. That the upside is we're taking it on ourselves to educate those that make these rules. And to Alistair's point, you don't need rules coming from government for everything. We can start to develop systems and corrections around the needs of our own community. And then ultimately, one thing we hear consistently when we talk to folks in authority positions is, I travel this way. I love it when I travel, but here are the problems I'm seeing in my community. And I'd rather have that be the starting point for the conversation than, I don't understand these things, I don't like them. But now I think people are seeing the value. And the last statistic I'll say is Rent Responsibly, with some of our partners, did a COVID-19 impact study in May of last year. In the middle of all this, we had 1,400 people respond. And one of the questions we asked was, in terms of the nature of people staying at your accommodations. In March, virtually 90% of reservations went away, but 50% of people responding said they were hosting or had a guest who was a frontline worker or somebody displaced, sent off campus, had nowhere to live, their flights were canceled. And so we should lean into this story, which is a true story of resiliency. These are accommodations that are flexible and they're able to serve multiple purposes, and they ultimately have a place in every community, and we should be proud of that. We need to lean into that. And that is the great appreciation moment that we're going to lead into.
Can I maybe follow on from that, Andy? Because I think for me, one of the most inspiring stories of the pandemic was actually what happened in the UK, where back in March we had obviously lots of companies where their properties were from one night to the other empty. And more than 30 companies across the whole of the UK came together and offered 1,500 properties across the whole of the UK to NHS workers. And there's a couple of things, because it's interesting, of course, that happened. And what I loved was that a sector that was in probably its worst moment that it's ever seen. And actually what people did was come together, collaborate, and do something good. And I cannot stress how important that was in the conversations that we were having at that time with government. That, normally the conversations are about, oh, how are they going to regulate the sector and registration or licensing and, all the typical regulation kind of conversations. And all of a sudden they changed. And yes, there were challenges around the pandemic, making sure that people were not hosting stays they shouldn't, and following all the rules that they needed to. But to have that community-based, program that we ran, NHS Homes, really helped all of the conversations we were having, and government and other stakeholders' belief that as an industry, actually, there's a lot of good people in this industry trying to support their communities. But actually what's more interesting coming out of that was that for the first time, government said we would actually be prepared to pay for stays in short-term rentals, but only if the whole industry comes together under one umbrella and there's one way that we can do it. And so out of that, as an industry, we created Trusted Stays. And so now any professional company can get onto Trusted Stays and can sell into government and corporates. And we're also working now to get into GDS, which is, again, a walled garden. Hotels and service departments and things have always been able to sell through GDS. And GDS always said, nope, short-term rentals cannot be on GDS. And we're now breaking down those barriers because of what's happened over the last year. And also, as Dave mentioned, the changing demand. Workers are, if they travel for work, they're going to need different types of accommodation. They may travel for a week or two at a time in one location rather than day trips here and there. So all of a sudden, the traditional industry, be that government, corporates, et cetera, are now actually looking at us in a different way. And we're starting to have new channels to market, again, because of the approach that we've taken as an industry. But I think looking to the future, the way that we do that is through us as associations having our own accreditation, driving those standards ourselves. We don't need to wait for government to write the regulations. We already have STAR accreditation in the UK, and we've partnered with Quality and Tourism to deliver that and ensure that government and everyone else can look at that and say, oh, this is a standard that, has credibility. And I think that's really important, because the last thing any of us want is government coming and writing the rules for us. We've seen, as Alistair said, what that looks like over the last year. And I don't think any of us want to see that in the future. Much better for us to write the standards ourselves and say, this is the bar we should all be operating to, and making sure that consumers are choosing that government can trust that, and that we get operators signed up so that the good operators who do things professionally stand out from the crowd. And I think commercial opportunities like being able to sell into government and sell into corporates are hopefully a carrot to say, look, get accredited, not only because it's the right thing to do, but also because there's a commercial value to your business to do it. And I think that's actually really exciting. And, I also think that, coming back to what Dave said earlier, the more that government stays in our accommodation, the more that corporates stay in our accommodation, the more that people understand the value that it provides and understand the quality they can get, the better chance that we've got of not having, draconian measures and people trying to shut down our industry. So I think all better that they can experience it.
I think that pretty much what you and Dave have both very eloquently said is that the sector has, and it actually speaks to Alistair's point as well about the amount of stuff that the sector and the small operators in the sector have had to deal with. It shows an amazing amount of not just resilience, but versatility through the things you've mentioned. But equally, some of the entrepreneurial capacity is incredible. The idea of moving from offering NHS work as a place to stay to building out a trusted stays that could be in the GDS, that could be available to government travellers, government workers, etc. That's territory that's just like, that's completely brand new, that's just not been done before. And that, I would argue, is almost impossible for the more established operators to react in the way that the short-term rental spaces react so flexibly and nimbly with such a weight of stuff upon them. So I'm fully in agreement. I mean, Alistair, I know that your members have turned to you to try and navigate through these kind of waters with all the things that have been going on. Have you had that same feeling that your members have shown that resilience? And are there any specific success stories that you can point to coming out of that? Oh, you're on mute, Alistair.
I think the sector across the whole, you know, I'm hearing America too, you know, has been, had to be incredibly versatile and fleet of foot in order to survive. You know, it's amazing what people are capable of when everything's at stake. And, you know, we've seen, you know, in England, we always say it's our fighting spirit. Well, you've probably got it in America, you've probably got it in Canada, you've probably got it in France, you've probably got it in Italy. But
the human spirit.
Everybody's got a fighting spirit when they're really up against it. And I think the sector has shown the points that have been made by David and Alexa and Merilee are about flexibility, speed of action, you know, ability to move quickly. These are very flexible models. You know, we're not tied to a vast, you know, infrastructure within, say, a hotel or whatever, or a business model that's predicated on providing you know, cooking for them and stuff. We can do whatever we like with the space, and we're offering a private self-contained space. So it plays to all of those things that the three colleagues have said. So we are able to do that. So one of the, I heard what Merilee was saying, and that it's slightly city-centric, talking about a big opportunity for government and corporate stays. That is more predicated on the urban. But we've got exactly the same thing happening in the rural and coastal with people who now now work from home, and their bosses don't care if they work from home and that home for a week is in the southwest of England or Scotland, as long as they're doing the job. So you can now go and work in a really nice place overlooking a beach, and at 5 o'clock you knock off and you go surfing and you're still at work. You know, there's a whole new world of opportunity out there for the right kind of businesses. You know, my own business, we're not seeing any shortfall in the corporate business we built up pre-COVID. They still want to come, they still want to do all of the stuff. And that's midweek business. Well, midweek business in rural and coastal contexts is gold dust, because, you know, we can sell weekends until we're blue in the face. I guess it's, you know, in the city, it's maybe, you know, a more 7-day, 365 days a year, but in the rural and coastal context, you come out of the main season and it starts becoming very weekend orientated. So business people coming down fills the week. So it's the same, but subtly different to what everybody else has said. So I'm all with this opportunity. I think that we need to really, really sharpen our pencils and make sure that the offer going forward is fit for the appetite. That's what I said earlier on. You know, we got to deliver for these people. So when they come down and they open their Apple Mac on the table looking out of the window, the Wi-Fi's got to work. You know, it gets down to some, you know, Wi-Fi is the new hot water. You know, if you don't have hot water, the guest is going to be really grumpy. Wi-Fi is the new hot water. You know, you've got to be able to provide the facilities for the people to do these things if you're offering them this service. That's what I think Merilee was talking about, standards. If you don't meet the standards they're expecting, you're going to lose that customer and he's going to go back to a hotel.
So before we go into the next one, I just want to let everybody know I'm going to pop up the next poll, and everybody go ahead and tap your answer while we go on to the next thing. I think it's very timely.
And do we have the results from the first poll, Tyann? Do you want to? One thing at a time, right?
One thing at a time, yeah.
Yes, I won't stress you. I'll give everyone a minute to hit that poll.
You got to leave a cliffhanger, Andy. Everybody's going to wait for these results later.
Exactly.
Build the drama. Build the drama.
Well, I'd kind of quite like to know where everyone is in the world. I think that one's fairly basic.
The majority of folks, 80%, are from the UK who are on this webinar. Interesting. Okay, that's good.
Well, let's kind of use that then. Alistair, let's just stick with you for a minute. I know that I want to pick up on that last point you made, because for the most of the last year, your members have been looking at you to kind of help them navigate the regulatory nightmare, the shifting sands. But let's assume for a minute that this next year is going to be somewhat different. I'm sure there's still going to be stuff to navigate, but not quite as intense. Are you shifting what you're looking for PASC to do in the way that you are serving your members? Like, what do you think they're looking from you for the next year?
I think we want to start getting the message to be much more, it's very negative, a message that talks about, where you get grant support from, how you help them with their business interruption claims and stuff. It's very technical and it's very dry and it's not very optimistic, but it's what's needed when that's the questions that are coming into the inbox. So we're starting to shift towards webinars on how you can make your business accessible, in a sense that 15 to 20% of the UK market is actually an accessible market. So if you're not in that, you're missing out. We're going to be talking about going much greener. The guest appetite is growing for sustainable tourism, for want of a better word, eco-tourism. And this is a sector that can deliver on that in spades. And then there's the kind of tech stuff that you and I talk about, and because we're kind of those kind of sad techie guys in the background, that we even
stick to yourself, Alistair.
Which is how we can let technology get embedded into our businesses, and Touch Day is a absolutely iconic example of that. How you can use simple tech. I know it's not simple behind the screen, but as far as the customer interface is concerned, simple technology to increase the quality of their experience, and so that who would have a guidebook in a self-catering short-term vacation rental now after they've seen a digital guidebook? It's incomprehensible to me. So these are the kind of things you've got to modernize your business so that the customers that come in what could be a bumper year for us really, really get the sense that this is a modern, up-to-date experience that they can really do so. Because there's no concierge downstairs to where's the best restaurant? Best restaurant, dead easy. It's in here. We can answer all of this stuff, and that's where we've got to drive. And only a small proportion of the 350,000 operators that there are in the UK, probably 20%, 25% will listen to those kind of messages, and those 60, 70,000 will fly. They will fly. I've always said it's down to three things: partners, pricing, and photographs. If you get those three things right, and then when the guest arrives, having been sold that, they'll stay. You'll have a customer for life.
Yeah, if you deliver on it, which is your point.
You've got to deliver on it. Promises are no good. You've got to deliver. You've got to deliver.
Yeah. Alexa, give us a bit of a flavour about what some of your members, some of the success stories, and the things that they've leaned on you from in the last year. Because I know I read the blog that you guys put out, the newsletter that you put out, and you've profiled some really, really interesting stories about what members have leaned on Rent Responsibly for, and the resulting success that they've had. So give us a couple of those examples.
Sure. You might be familiar with one of those subjects who's on this call right now, Ms. Tyann. When COVID first really brought everything to a grinding halt, one of the things that we knew that we could do really well that most other people probably wouldn't have the time to do is to capture exactly what you said, those success stories coming out of COVID. And what we saw in destination after destination was people leaning into this idea of flexibility and rapid response, like Dave mentioned. One of my favorite stories of all time, in addition to Tyann's, is that there is a short-term rental operator out of Philadelphia who has had a very long relationship with the hospitals there, particularly the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, called CHOP. What hospital staff realized was that as these families are coming to support the kids that are in the hospital, they can't always stay in a place like a hotel, or they don't have the budget for it, or for whatever reason, they need something that is a much better fit for families. And so Steve of Your Home in Philly, called Your Hip for short, has had this long relationship. And then COVID happened, and all of a sudden the other facilities for patients of the hospital, like the American Cancer Lodges, all shut down. And now these patients and their families needed a place to stay. And Steve and operators like him were at the ready with the perfect place for families and patients to stay. You guys all know really well that needs like this exist regardless of a pandemic, but the pandemic brought it to the forefront. So we got to talk to so many people offering places to hospital patients, to frontline workers, to emergency responders. We saw that time and time again. We captured a lot of those stories. Please go read them. They will warm your heart. I look at them every single day. What we started to see over time started to shift back towards the need for education and understanding and clarity on what's happening with the rules and the standards and the laws, not just related to COVID, but in general. We did a lot of member surveys towards the end of the last year, beginning of this year. And the number one request in almost every area that we surveyed is help understanding regulations and politics, and help understanding taxes. So not only what they owe, but who's collecting it, where do I submit it, how do I calculate it, all those kinds of questions. And so between that and how do I respond quickly to the needs of my community during a pandemic and otherwise, the other thing that we see a lot and that we're getting more and more frequently every day is help with organizing. So the really neat thing about that is, one, that's our job. That's what we're here to do, is help people organize. But when you have organized groups of hosts and managers in a neighborhood, in a town, in a county, in a state, things like understanding regulations and understanding taxes is a lot easier because you can communicate really easily with people who know this stuff and can share information with each other. Same thing when it comes to mobilizing really quickly when your community needs something. Hopefully we'll never have another pandemic, but there will certainly be other emergencies and other opportunities for short-term rentals and vacation rentals to step up to the plate and help the community. So lucky for us, we get to meet a lot of really cool people who need all these things. And just by organizing, we can help them all at one time.
Right, terrific, terrific. I think we're going to skip one of the questions. We're going to go towards the end because we're running out of time. I'm quite interested to hear from you all about the one thing that you think that operators in our industry can do to make 2021 a success, and even into 2022, some of the things they can do now that will be foundational for a good year, 2 years, 3 years into the future. Dave, why don't you kick us off with the answer there?
Well, I want to give the most self-serving and self-promotional answer, and so I'll give that one really quick, and then I'll give you one that I'm sure other people can vibe with maybe a little bit more. But honestly, if you're not involved in any sort of association or any sort of local group, now is really the time to do it, because as these frameworks and schemes for professionalization, for proposed rules and regs come out, the real interesting thing is people are starting to ask questions of, hey, you short-term rental community, how, what standards are already baked in to what professionals do? And COVID-19 cleaning rules is just a good example of who the heck would have thought of that. But now that people understand that there's maybe some more training that we can provide cleaners, things like that have just emerged, we're shaping our own future right now. So the one thing I'll say, this is the self-serving one, is help shape your own future. Don't complain. Then you can't complain when things happen that you didn't know about. And people like Merilee, people like Alistair, people like Rent Responsibly, we're trying to do that. So that's a give and a take. And rentresponsibly.org, no matter where you are, just sign up for that. It's free.
But wait, Dave, I would say it's not really self-serving. I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's through this past year. I would imagine if one of our poll questions had been, how much did you rely on others, and others really being PASC, being Rent Responsibility, being STAR, etc., to help you understand how to get through the stuff, I bet you it would be more than half, probably 3/4 of the people. And there's nothing self-serving about it. I think it's a really important message to put across there, is that in the hard times, we've all had to lean on organizations like yours. And in order for you to continue doing the great work that you're doing, you need that support in the good times as well. It's not just bye-bye during the good times, you know. Yeah, there's got to be support all the time. So I don't think it's self-serving. I think it's a really important point to make. Sorry, I just wanted to say that. Carry on.
No, and I mean, I guess it was just more of like a heads up. I'm about to tell you why I think the work that we're doing is really important. But here's the other thing that I think is really like critical, is the days of thinking that short-term vacation rentals, self-catering accommodations are not mainstream, you know, this whole alternative accommodations. Let's drop the alternative. These are preferred accommodations now, and we need to be proud. Honestly, the one thing is, I am just like dead set on this. I'm going to say it for the next 5 years. If you see me, I'm going to say this. Be proud. You're doing something good for your community. You're taking control of your own future. You're providing for your family, but you're also providing for visitors. The only way we educate and provide real, authentic, you know, experiences to people is peer-to-peer. And I think that's, you know, look at any sector that's being kind of modernized or disrupted. We're leading that. We're providing tremendous value. It hasn't been properly recognized by those that make the rules, but we're working on that every day. And the more we can collaborate, the theme of the year is collaborate, right? So if we can collaborate across the pond, Merilee and I have talked a lot about what we're doing, what she's doing, just get involved. And ultimately, it's basically your fastest way to kind of a business development activity, because you're going to learn, you're going to absorb, you're going to make friends, you're going to have these business related opportunities. Do you want to be the last one to get on the GDS? Do you want to be the last one with the technology like Touch Stay in your unit? Do you want to be the last one to upgrade your pictures? These are all companies that are looking for you, and we're centralizing around the organizations that we all lead. And we're probably the most passionate people about this stuff. You know, the water's warm, you know, time to jump in.
Well said. Merilee, what do you think?
I mean, look, I would also have, you know, I have to echo what Dave said and what you said, which is, you know, we're stronger together. So, you know, whatever association it is you join. I mean, certainly at the Short-Term Accommodation Association, we saw membership absolutely go through the roof this year because people needed help. They didn't know how to do things, and they wanted to make sure they were doing things right. And so I think, you know, all of us are out there to help people and to help the industry. I always talk about STAR's mission being to be able to responsibly grow the industry, because it is about growth. And so I think that's what associations are for. And there's loads of commercial opportunities that come out of them, as well as understanding the rules. But I think the bigger opportunity, if I step back and I think as a property manager, what are the things that are going to be most important, and how to use the next couple of months until things really open up fully again. It's have your technology in order, have all of the foundations of your business as strong as you possibly can. I mean, one of the things we do with Hosperia is that we integrate lots of different technologies so that any smaller property manager can access it all in one place. So they don't need to go and find lots of different technologies and figure out how they all work together. And I think there's lots of really cool things like that out there, which help people to make things simpler, because technology, as Alistair said, is so critical to people's growth. And it's not just technology about the guest-facing side, it's actually technology of how to run and grow your own business so that you can accommodate more owners in your portfolio, so that you can bring more guests into your properties and manage that efficiently. And also so that you can access more guests. You know, it's really difficult in these times, you know, and that's whether you're a holiday homes operator in the countryside trying to fill those weeks in the off season, or whether that's a city operator who's looking for more leisure travelers. You know, all of those things require you to be out there on as many platforms as possible, whether that's GDS, whether that's on new platforms like Marriott Homes and Villas, and accessing those new customers is going to be critical to the growth of our sector. And my goal is that I don't want our sector to get bought up by the likes of Vacasa and people like that, because actually the authentic experiences is what we bring. So the more that we can empower the entrepreneurs in our sector to grow their own businesses, and the more that they can access the technology to help them do that easily, I think the sky's the limit as to what can be achieved over the next couple of years.
I think the last thing you said there for me was like right on the money, which is we've just seen Vacasa buy Turnkey, and there are now probably, I don't know what the property count is anymore, but it's still a tiny percentage of the total inventory out there in the world. And there are so many small operators that it's just going to be impossible for that to be consolidated into big vehicles anytime soon. So with that comes the need to differentiate, to really focus on like what you are hands down good at, like what you really represent. So I totally buy into what you just said there, Merilee. Thank you. Alexa, I'm going to come to you, Alistair, in a second, but Alexa, just because you have had these interactions with the likes of Tyann and the person you mentioned in Philadelphia, you've had these kind of real stories. Do you get a sense that there's kind of one or two things that you think people should focus on going forward, having seen the context of the last year with those case studies you've done?
Absolutely. I think as Dave mentioned, and I think everybody's mentioned on this call, acknowledging the flexibility of a property and what that means to your community, particularly in times of crisis, is critical. Not only can you rapidly adjust the use of your property from a vacation rental to a temporary place for somebody like a frontline worker to stay, not only is that like a great thing in and of itself, it helps show your community as a whole that short-term rentals and vacation rentals are an asset. So the more you can do to highlight that around your community, just the better off you'll be in the long run, in the big picture. The other thing that I would add is I come from a journalist background, so I write these stories, but I also come from communications, and communication, particularly when things are tricky or complicated or moving fast, is absolutely essential. And I think we've all learned that and been on the receiving end of poor communications from every direction throughout this whole thing. But what we've learned throughout the pandemic is that clear, frequent, on-time communication really matters. And even after COVID ends, those lessons should and can stick with us. And it can be a really great way to win not only new guests, but the right guests for your property. Make sure that the expectations that you're setting for your property are great, but they're also realistic. And especially when it comes to short-term rentals, and the beauty of them being that they are these authentic local experiences. There are some things that guests should probably know about short-term rentals that they might not be expecting, or that they think might be very similar to hotels but are not. So the more clear you can be in your communications, the more frequently asked questions you can answer ahead of time, the more frequent you can be in touch with your guests and make sure that they're aware of all these things that they should know and be excited to enjoy. Not only will you get better reviews in the end, you'll also get, like I mentioned, guests who are a better fit for your property, higher quality, will probably pay attention to your house rules and honor those house rules better and make for happy neighbors. There's a lot of domino effects that happen with good communication, and there's a lot that we can learn from
May
that.
I come in there? Because I think that is a really important point as well. The communication aspect is often overlooked. And if there's something that the last 12 months has taught us, is that the need to communicate very clearly with guests about everything that you are doing, not only for cleanliness, etc., but what you stand for as well, is a total, an absolute requirement going forward. No crappy copy on your website, no bad communication or zero communication post-booking, pre-arrival. You should be trying to engage. And actually, we did a podcast the other day with somebody who said that operators should be actually encouraging guest communication, should be encouraging discussions with guests, even if it's more intense to manage, because through doing that, you end up serving the guest in a way, way better way. So I think communication, fantastic point there, Alexa, great. Last word, Alistair. By all means, talk about something else if you want to, about what you think the one thing that they should do going forward. But I picked up on your sustainability point, and I thought that was really interesting. It's something that has kind of percolated for a while. But we've got Earth Day coming mid-April, and we've got people reflecting on lives, etc., which naturally lends itself perhaps to thinking about how sustainable we can be as businesses. Is that something that's important for you going forward?
Well, for me personally, it is. We've just completed the REST accreditation from Quality in Tourism, which is responsible, ethical, sustainable tourism. We've been gold green tourism since 1935 or whenever we started. You know, it's really important. And our guests, I would be dishonest if I said that every guest is looking for a sustainable badge before they book. But when they actually come and they see what it means in the context of not interfering with their holiday and actually improving the experience, the feedback we get on it is absolutely fantastic. So our repeat guests are therefore right up the scale. Therefore, our cost of bookings is down through the floor. Our guest satisfaction is up, and then we're back into the whole thing. So my post 2 days ago was about we're zero to landfill, you know, all of these things. So my social media posts aren't always about how comfortable the sofa is or how warm the swimming pool is. They're often about our engagement in the community and how all of those things. So that comms thing, I absolutely get. I would like though to end on a really vulgar note, which is pricing, okay? Which you don't expect British people to talk about. Pricing is so unbelievably important, okay? And we have been underselling the short-term vacation rental, self-catering sector for more than a decade. It drives me mad. In America, you probably do it price per night. Is that more common in the US? We still struggle in the UK that you've got to price the break, which makes it look much more expensive, even though actually per person per night, it's peanuts, because hotels price per night. We need to get to the American model and price per night so people can see when you're putting 4 people in that beach house I just talked about, so 2 couples can go away and work away from home for a week. It's £50 a person per night. It's a steal. It's astonishingly good value. And that's probably double what some people are trying to get at the moment. So we need to really think about the way that we price and do the pricing models. I can't wait for the American pricing model to come over here.
I think pricing is a whole other discussion. I totally agree with you. I stayed with a customer of ours in Canberra Sands over the summer, and he said to me that the weeks that he was renting throughout the summer were double the price that he had been renting them for the prior season. And he said to me, one of his challenges is trying to talk to his owners and let them know that they should not expect that in the following summers, etc. But actually, I do think that there is an expectation to be better at pricing. So I agree with you. We've only got a few minutes left. If there's anybody in the audience that wants to ask a question that hasn't asked a question, please do so. We've just got a few minutes of these lovely people's time. But one of the questions I saw you answer, Dave, Rent Responsibly is not just a US organization, correct?
So we're in the US and we're working with a lot of communities in the US, but I think a lot of the education and stories we tell are universal. So we fancy ourselves, I think that's a British term, but
it is.
We fancy ourselves as an intergalactic organization, meaning we don't really draw territorial boundaries. But I would point you to, your experts, Merilee and Alistair. But, signing up for our information is free and it's universal.
Grand, thank you. And, not just to join Responsibly, but also to feed off the energy that you have and the passion you have for the industry. So I'm sure that comes across in both the material that you and Alexa, and I see your newsletters, I know it comes across. Terrific, thank you. Tyann, are there any other questions that have come in?
Well, would you like to know the poll answers here?
Oh, yes.
I am sure everybody wants to know that. So how optimistic are you about the success of your business in 2021? And I honestly am very I'm very optimistic about your all's optimistic answers, especially with it being majority of our folks right now being from the UK. So bumper season, very optimistic, is 43% of folks, which is wonderful. And the next one, prepping the beds, cautiously optimistic, is 49%. So
oh, wow.
I think that is fantastic. And then 6% of folks are holding tight. It's not looking good for them. And 1% is under lockdown currently.
So
I could not answer. 9 out of 10. Yeah. I mean, personally, I would have answered the last one. Are you kidding? Spring break and Easter holiday is here already. Meaning we're crazy nuts right now with guests. But yeah, I think it's very nice to see the optimism through the roof.
Excellent. Good. There was a comment about pricing, but I think it's an agreement comment, correct? Yes, it is.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, it is. Thank you. Yes. All right, let's wrap up. Thank you, everybody. I thought it was fantastic. I thought you all had some really, really excellent points. I hope the attendees got some value out of that. I want to thank you all for your time. I know that you're all really busy people, and I know that you're all amazing people, so you're probably in demand elsewhere. So thank you for coming on and for sharing your perspective.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you
You're
all.
welcome. See you later. Bye.